based on some simple premises. Preventive strategies are very important in the care of critical care patients and need the comparatively support of the entire team that handles such patients. As you can see, the patient in a critical care setup has got so many external devices inside him that he becomes very vulnerable, and it requires the support of the entire team of people caring from him, from the administrative to the nursing and the physicians, to be aware of some of the basic principles that are involved in preventing any infection and as much as we can lower it. The learning objectives for this module are early recognition, isolation and reporting of infection. This is very important that you are able to detect or think of infection in certain kind of patients who are being treated for critical care. Adopt basic infection control measures that will reduce the risk and transmission of pathogens. Adopt correct techniques of hand hygiene, which is the single most important factor that will prevent infection in critical care patients. Appropriate use of personal protective equipment, environment cleaning, adopt correct methods of bio-waste segregation and disposal, and of course post-exposure prophylaxis. Infection in critical care areas is seen all over the world. They exist in the developed world from 5 to 10%, but in developing countries and in India, the rates are much higher. ICU patients are vulnerable to mortality because of infections to an extent of up to 30%. Chain of infection. Consequences of infection due to the endogenous flora are very high. They depend on the quality of the pathogen that is available for causing infection, the virulence of the pathogen, which is now seen the trend has moved towards more resistant pathogens colonizing the patient that is brought in to the intensive care units. Routes of transmission. Contact transmission is by direct or indirect contact with patients or the patient care environment, and examples are shigellosis, viral hemorrhagic fever are to name a few. Aerosol transmission is inhalation of infectious particles or droplets in the air. Droplet infection are by large droplets generated by coughing, sneezing. H1N1, Neisseria meningitidis, pertussis are clear examples of such spread infection where the particles are large and they do not travel more than 1 meter away from the patient's site. Airborne infections or droplet nuclei are smaller particles that are airborne for a longer time and spread by particles that remain infectious while suspended in the air. And tuberculosis is a classical example of droplet nuclei which can spread far and wide from the origin of the patient. This slide shows you the nasopharyngeal particles, the tracheobronchial particles and the alveolar particles, which are inhalable fractions that can be spreading infection in the environment. Breaking the chain of infection, that is the motto of the infection control team, that it has to break the chain of infection. The source control is teaching the cough etiquette to patients that are infectious, cleaning and disinfection. Modes of transmission by contact is hand hygiene. This is the single most criteria and the infection control measure that has to be adopted in any kind of setting to prevent transmission of infection by contact. Droplet distance from source more than 1 meter is liable to spread the infection far and wide, and that is where the droplet nuclei come in. Airborne ventilation is another mode where it can spread, localize the spread or prevent the spread of infection. Vector, in places where vectors like mosquitoes can spread the infection, you've got to use bed nets. Portal of entry into the host is adding barriers, and that is where the personal protective equipment come into fore, and we will be talking about that later. The host, strengthen the host defenses. This is a common mechanism we use in the community, and we must take the immunological profile of the patient like vaccination to know whether his host defenses have been strengthened or not. 5 essential steps for preventing cross transmission. Organisms are present on the patient's skin or have been shed on surrounding inanimate objects in the immediate vicinity. It must be known to all specialists in critical care that within 24 hours the patient's flora changes to the environmental flora, which consists of highly resistant organisms. because they dominate the environment and overtake the local organisms that have come in with the patient. Organisms are transferred to the hands of healthcare workers moment the patient has come into the environment. Organisms must be capable of survival on the healthcare workers' hands for several minutes. We will be giving a detailed chart of the minutes that the organisms survive, and you will be surprised to see the variation in the time that the organisms survive. Hand washing is not done or is inadequate, or agent usually does not cover the organism. Contaminated hand comes in direct contact with another patient or inanimate object that may come in contact with the patient. These are the steps of cross transmission of infection. I will be talking of the general infection control measures under the following headings already discussed, and the special or specific infection control measures which relate to specific procedures, from catheters to IV lines to central venous lines and surgical site infections, will be discussed separately in another lecture. The first point is recognition of critical care patient at risk of infection. This is extremely important to judge whether a patient is going to be vulnerable and how vulnerable he will be, depending on the following criteria: old age, more than 70 years, patient in shock, major trauma, renal failure, coma, prior antibiotics. When he is transferred from another hospital, he is liable to more infectious processes and highly resistant infection by MDR organisms. He is already on mechanical ventilation. He is on steroids. If the patient is on steroids and chemotherapy, he is liable to get infections more easily. And if he comes in with indwelling catheters and has a prolonged stay in the ICU for more than 3 days, this must be also tackled in a logical way, where you don't need a patient to be in ICU. He must be sent out from that environment to a de-escalated ward. Assess the need for isolation. This is important when patient has neutropenia and immunological disorders, diarrhea, skin rashes, known communicable diseases where you suspect H1N1, you must keep him separately in a separate room. Known carriers of an epidemic strain of organism. If the organism has already been isolated and he is coming with a report that says that an organism which could have an epidemic strain, he should be kept in isolation. What are the type of isolation needed? There are two types of isolation in the ICU. The first is the positive pressure isolation. Positive pressure is for neutropenic or other immunocompromised patients to reduce the chances of acquiring opportunistic infections. They require 6 to 12 air changes per hour. Then you have the negative pressure isolation, which is more commonly available, and source of isolation of colonized or infected patients to minimize potential transmission to other patients and staff. These are the basic methods of isolation. But in case in a hospital where you are not able to provide such strict negative or positive control, you can cohort patients together in one part of the ward to prevent transmission to people who do not have a certain infection. These diagrams show you basic outlay of patients, where the wind current should be in which direction. If the wind direction is on the patient and then comes on to the healthcare workers, it is bad, because the airflow will allow the organisms to come into your system. So this type of a bed outlay is not correct. You got a good outlay when you have the wind coming on to the healthcare worker and then flowing onto the patient and then out of the cubicle or room or the ward. And then of course there is a good compromise where you can keep them in this kind of fashion. But this is a basic measure where you know how the bed outlay in a ward should be. Hand hygiene, it cannot be stressed as importantly how important it is that this is practiced and followed by each and every one handling critical care patients or anybody working in the ICU. Observe hand hygiene how? Wash hands with soap and water when they are soiled or visibly dirty with blood or other body fluids, and wet your hands, apply soap and then scrub, and then use a disposable towel. Use a alcohol based hand rub which has 0.5% chlorhexidine and 70% ethanol. Now, bacterial survival time on hands, as I was mentioning, You can see the range. Klebsiella can last for 2 minutes, while Acinetobacter can remain on your hand for 60 minutes. And since Acinetobacter is an emerging drug resistant bacteria, it is of vital importance that we are aware of this impact on how we should wash our hands correctly. Pseudomonas can remain for 30 minutes, it can remain for 180 minutes in the sputum. Rotavirus has got 20 minutes survival and extend up to 60 minutes. Hand hygiene should be undertaken mandatorily under 5 exclusive conditions in the ward: before touching a patient, before clean or an aseptic procedure is undertaken in the ward, after body fluid exposure risk, after touching a patient, and after touching patient surroundings. Please remember, even if you are not doing the procedure but you are around the patient surroundings and handling or touching the railings, it is mandatory that you wash your hands, because organisms are lurking around each and every corner of the hospital environment. This is the proper technique of hand washing, which I think the diagram very graphically shows you how the palms, the back of the hand, the thumb and the wrists all have to be thoroughly washed before you proceed with gloving your hand or doing a procedure. These are the situations where you undertake a hand wash and a hand rub. This is important and must be known to all critical care health personnel, because it differentiates between the amount of organism that is on your hands and the load that is present. Hand wash to be undertaken before starting hospital duty every day, at the end of the hospital duty, and when hands are visibly dirty or visibly soiled. That is another very important time when you must undertake a very rigorous hand wash, and after using the toilet. While hand rub is a shorter time period method, if the hands are not visibly soiled before or after touching a patient, and since hand rubs are available at every bed in the intensive care, they are easily undertaken, but must be done with proper procedural outlay as shown before. Before handling invasive devices that are put in, moving from contaminated body side to another body side, and after contact with the patient's surrounding. After removing sterile or non-sterile gloves also, you should do an hand rub. And these are the graphics showing you the procedures and the steps to be undertaken. These posters must be put up near the basins or the place where the hand wash or hand rubs are to be undertaken, and at various locations in the wards, so that all healthcare personnel are made aware of the procedure and have not forgotten the steps that have to be undertaken to do this in the correct manner. Because as I repeatedly will emphasize, that hand wash and hand rub have been by various studies proved to be the most important criteria and reason for infection in the intensive care setting. Despite hand washing, you can see the sites where bacteria are lurking. In spite of all the effort that you can put in, you will find sites where they are most frequently missed, where they are less frequently missed, and where they are not missed. So this depicts you, gives you the picture of where the organisms can last. These graphics show you the location of organisms in a patient. As you can see, all the clothing or the drapes around the patient's oral cavity, the face, they are always in higher concentration. When you are examining the pulse, blood pressure, they are getting transferred from the patient's body to onto your hands, and that's how it is transmitted. They survive in various areas of the hand of the healthcare worker, and the interdigital space is a very good area for them to be present, and that is why when you undertake hand wash or hand rub, you must ensure that the interdigital space is cleaned properly and thoroughly. Incorrect hand washing, where only the fingertips are washed, will be not adequate to remove all organisms, as lower down on the thumb up to the base of the wrist, these organisms are present and will be able to transmit infection into the subsequent patient. Failure to clean hands will lead to cross transmission, and anybody Observing such a failure in undertaking hand washing must point it out to the concerned healthcare personnel, the doctor or the nurse, and see that it is rectified. Personal protective equipment were undertaken long back during the earlier epidemics of plague and things like that, but even now it holds a very important place in prevention of infection. Organisms liberated while talking are from 0 to 3,500, while sneezing they go up to 1 lakh. Droplets can remain suspended in the air for hours. Personal protective equipment protect healthcare workers. Respirators may be unavailable in low resource settings, and face and surgical masks act as barriers, and face and surgical masks do not protect against inhalation of microscopic tuberculosis or Mycobacterium tuberculosis organisms. Personal protective equipment for transmission based precautions are contact precautions. The first are use of gloves and gowns. Next is droplet precautions are medical masks. Droplet, as you are aware, are heavy droplets in the air which have got water particles also along with the dust particles and the organism. They are heavy particles which settle down and do not travel more than 1 meter. Airborne precautions when you require particulate respirators to prevent transmission of infection. Masks and respirators, these have come into importance of recent times because of various infectious diseases that are transmitted airborne. Respirators rely on an airtight seal and have tiny pores which block droplet nuclei. Masks have large pores and do not have an airtight seal around them to permit inflow of droplet nuclei. Those dealing with suspected H1N1 patients must wear respirators, and because they travel within 1 meter or close to the patient, and that is the reason why they need to wear respirators when dealing with such patients. Further away need not wear masks because, as pointed out earlier, droplet particles do not travel more than 1 meter. Do's of wearing a mask: they must fit snugly at the nose and chin. The poor fit at the chin can be seen in this slide here, in this photograph here. Respirator should cover the chin and create a seal, and the bridge of the nose is another site where the respirator is not fitting properly, also is inadequate for the protection of the healthcare personnel. Do not hang the respirator or the mask around your neck and move around or move out of the ward where the patient is being treated. Respiratory hygiene and cough etiquette, this must be inculcated in the patients. It's a part of the standard precautions. Education of healthcare workers, patients and visitors must be told when they come to visit their patient. Source control, cover cough to prevent dissemination of infectious particles. Elbow of the hand is a prominent site where cough can be undertaken when his patient is coughing, so that it does not go into the air. Hand hygiene to be followed, and spatial separation more than 1 meter would be adequate to prevent transmission of droplets in the air. Airborne precautions: disease causing microorganisms may be suspended in the air as small particles, aerosols or dust, and remain infective over time. Mycobacterium tuberculosis, varicella zoster virus, herpes zoster are airborne and can travel long distances as they go by the droplet nuclei mode of transmission. Such patients can be isolated with negative pressure ventilation, and the N95 respirator mask is good for both large and small droplets, that is droplets or droplet nuclei. Wear a mask and adequate eye protection or a face shield to protect mucous membranes of the eyes, nose and mouth, and that are likely to be generated when you are doing any procedure where aerosols can come in the air. Patients, relatives and healthcare workers presenting with respiratory symptoms should also use masks. Precautions for droplet infections: because of their size, large particles more than 5 microns in size usually are in droplets. They do not travel far and within 1 meter they drop at the place wherever they are located. And Bordetella pertussis, Haemophilus, Neisseria, Mycoplasma pneumoniae, SARS associated are various infectious conditions which can be transmitted by the droplet infection. Isolation is required and respiratory protection only when you come within 1 meter of the patient. Sterile gloves should be worn after hand hygiene for performing sterile procedures. Clean, non-sterile gloves are safe for touching blood, other body fluids and contaminated items. Change glove between procedures in the same patient when moving from a contaminated area to a clean area. Remove gloves after caring for a patient and undertake hand hygiene after removing gloves, as gloves do not give you 100% protection from infection because of the presence of pores. So, this procedure must be undertaken. These are the standard precautions for wearing, donning and doffing of personal protective equipment. While donning, first step is to undertake hand hygiene, then you wear the gown, the goggles, the cap, mask and the gloves to be worn at the end. And the last step is the gloves, because they are the site where the infection should not be present, or the any of the bacteria or organism should not be present. While removing, it is the other way around, where the gloves should be removed first. You can undertake hand hygiene if you follow all the procedures correctly, then the goggles, then the gown. The mask is the most contaminated personal protective equipment and must be removed in the end along with the cap. Clean hospitals also need clean environment. Just clean hands and won't do and prevent infection in this sort of a setting, and a clean environment can be undertaken by various cleaning processes which have to be repeatedly taken. Surfaces are contaminated with MRSA, vancomycin resistant enterococci and Clostridium difficile, and they can result in indirect transmission of bacteria by mechanisms by the airborne transmission or contact transmission. Here in this slide you can see the inanimate environment and the site where various organisms are present, which is astounding, because if you see all the gadgets and the equipment surrounding the patient have been seen to be contaminated, or presence of organisms have been seen which are VRE positive also. Contact precautions can be direct or indirect with an infected person. As already mentioned, the conditions in which they can be transmitted, you have to be very careful in all such patients, as influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, chickenpox, herpes zoster and hepatitis. Isolation is essential, and limit transport of such patients from one ward or one part of the ward to the other. Consider environmental factors. Cleaning and disinfection is extremely important. High quality cleaning and disinfection of all patient care areas is important, especially surfaces close to the patient. This must be ensured. The bed rails, bedside tables, doorknobs and equipment. Some pathogens survive for long periods in the environment, particularly MRSA, vancomycin resistant enterococci, Acinetobacter, Clostridium difficile and norovirus. Disinfection which are approved and of good quality must be used in all such places. Frequency of cleaning: surface cleaning twice weekly, floor cleaning must be taken up 2 to 3 times a day, and terminal cleaning after discharge or death of a patient. This should be the normal standard operating procedure for cleaning in the ward. Follow the SOPs laid down by the hospital and the ICU staff on cleaning of floors, walls, curtains, linen, equipment and toilets. Use an appropriate sporicidal agent in correct concentrations. Soap and water at 80 degrees centigrade is one of the very good agents which is to be used, easily available and can be undertaken repeatedly in the wards. Sodium hypochlorite or bleach is excellent because it takes care of many of the resistant organisms. Glutaraldehyde, peracetic acid and hydrogen peroxide dry mist are other agents that can be used to clean the environment. Used patient care equipment soiled with blood, body fluid, secretions or excretion should be handled carefully to prevent skin and mucous membrane transmission. Contamination of clothing and transfer of microorganisms to healthcare workers or other patients or the environment. Ensure that single-use items and sharps are discarded properly. Now, this is the role of environment in transmission of selected pathogens. Your environment in the ICU setting can have Clostridial difficile that can survive for months, VRE from days to weeks, MRSA from days to weeks, Acinetobacter for more than a month. They can survive on your hands also and last longer in the environment. Pseudomonas does not survive too long, and ESBLs can survive from days to weeks in the environment, and that is the reason that makes ICUs so vulnerable to multi-drug resistant organisms, especially ESBL, colonizing all the patients present there. These are various other disinfectants that can be used, and household bleach remains a very good agent that is to be utilized. Architecture and layout of the ICU is also very important. ICU critical care unit should be located close to the operating room, emergency department for easy accessibility but away from the ward areas. Central air conditioning system with 99% efficiency and HEPA filters should be used to prevent any airborne transmission from the environment. Air movement should always be from clean to dirty areas. It is recommended that a minimum of 6 total air changes per room per hour with 2 air changes per hour should be undertaken. Isolation facility with negative and positive pressure should be there. Demarcated routes of traffic flow through the ICU should also be followed. This is a very simple procedure but must be adhered to by all the staff. Adequate space around the bed from 2.5 to 3 meters must be there. Electricity, air, vacuum outlets connection should not be hamper access around the beds. So the layout of all this equipment should be done properly so that it doesn't hamper any accidents or any damage to the or harm to the patient. Adequate number of wash basins must be available with adequate posters. There should be no shortage of hand cleaning material. Alcohol gel dispensers are required at ICU entry, exit and every bed space and every workstation. There should be separate medication preparation area, separate areas for clean soil and storage and disposable of various material. Adequate toilet facility should be provided. Lastly, we come to the bio-waste management, which is very important as far as infection control is considered. A lot of hazardous infective waste is generated in the intensive care unit and must be handled in the appropriate laid down guidelines. Biomedical waste is any waste which is generated during diagnosis, treatment or immunization of human beings or animals or in research activities. That is the legal definition of bio-waste. You got healthcare waste, which can be divided into hazardous, non-hazardous. In the ICU setting, we have got infectious and non-infectious. The sharps, non-sharps, plastic disposable, liquid waste are all infectious waste and must be treated with uttermost care and sincerity. As you see, all infectious waste should go into the yellow marked bins, which include soil dressings, bandages, samples after disinfection, anatomical parts, culture waste, infected gloves and gowns. We are concerned more with soil dressings, bandages and samples after disinfection. Plastic waste is also considered infected waste, and along with catheters, central lines, tubings and saline bottles to be discarded in that. Sharps have to be cut with a needle cutter, and then broken vials and all to be put in a leak proof container to be disposed separately. You got glass waste, food items and office general waste which are separately disposed of. These bags should be filled up when they are 3/4 filled. Please do not wait for the entire bag to be filled up, because it can spill and cause an environmental contamination. Seal the mouth and then it is transported out of the ward and taken care of by the infection control team. Needle should be burned in a needle burner and put in 1% hypochlorite solution for disinfection, and cut IV bottles before they are discarded. Post-exposure prophylaxis, this is very important for all healthcare workers, and we have to ensure that there is no spread of infection by any accidental needle stick injury. Do not squeeze or suck the area. Wash the area immediately with plenty of soap and water. If there is splash on the eyes, irrigate eyes with water or saline. Report to the ICU consultant or any other designated doctor in the hospital. Immediately check for HIV, HBsAg and HCV status of the source. Blood for HIV testing of the exposed person after counseling, and first dose of ART to be given within 2 hours and ART to be continued for 28 days. Did you know that 0.1 ml of blood is enough to cause infection in case of HIV, where it is 0.00004 ml of blood that is enough to cause hepatitis B infection. 88 million healthcare workers and related occupation worldwide are at risk of occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogen. So with this kind of statistics, you have to be extremely careful that none of the healthcare workers and personnel working at your setup should get any such infection, and this can only be ensured if we take very diligent measures to see that protective measures are taken. According to WHO, injections with contaminated syringes cause 21 million hepatitis B, 2 million hepatitis C and 2,60,000 HIV infections. These statistics are stupendous and should be a warning of how careful we need to be in personal prophylaxis. All to ensure that they take 3 doses of hepatitis B at 0, 1 and 3 month intervals. If the source is hepatitis B positive and exposed person is immunized, check anti-HBsAg antibody titer. If it is greater than 10 million international units, no intervention required. If less, then they should be given the immunization schedule. If the exposed person not immunized, give hepatitis B immunoglobulin and a first dose of hepatitis B vaccine. Organizational and administrative measures. Better nurse to patient ratio must be maintained in the ICU. Visitor policy, waste and sharp disposable policy, education and training of ICU staff periodically as they undertake a lot of change of staff is there. So everybody must be periodically educated on various measures. ICU protocols for prevention of nosocomial infection, audit and surveillance of infection and infection control practices. This is extremely important. Microbiological surveillance of the ICU organisms give us a feedback to start empiric therapy and an idea of what kind of organisms prevail in your particular environment. Antibiotic stewardship, this is an important component of infection control, that antibiotic usage is done as per the stewardship and with lot of discussion and discrimination rather than random use. Vaccination of healthcare personnel. Take home message finally, as far as infection control is concerned, on ICU admission, assess the need and type of isolation and identify patients at risk of getting infection in the critical care setting. Observe strict hand hygiene practices. Follow standard precautions for personal protection, that is the use of gloves, gowns, caps and masks. Follow transmission based precautions for airborne, droplet and contact precautions. Use strategies to prevent specific interventions or specific infections, which include catheter associated urinary tract infection, catheter related and central line related bloodstream infection and surgical site infection. Consider environmental factors that play a very important role in prevention of infection control. Employ organizational and administrative measures to see that all the protocols and infection control measures are in place and there is no deficiency in any way. Finally, it is important to mention that all those taking care of critical care patients and working in the ICU must not hesitate to pinpoint or tell somebody who is not following the protocols to do it correctly, because this is something that the compliance has to be ensured. Only then we can ensure that infection in the intensive care unit and care of critical care patients is taken appropriately. Thank you very much.